They vanished on the night of their wedding rite after their first dance. No one saw them leave. No one heard a thing, and for over a decade, there were no answers. But then, a drone flying over a forgotten forest captured something no one expected ... and everything changed. This isn't just a story about a missing couple. It's about love, obsession, and the power of truth to rise, even after years of silence. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Leave a comment below and say hello. Your voice matters here. Now, let's begin. Asterisk. The sun was just beginning to dip below the golden hills of Northern California when Laura Bennett became Laura Walker, and the entire town of Woodpine gathered to celebrate the kind of wedding most people only see in old photo albums or the last few pages of a well-loved romance novel. The air was warm with the scent of pine and jasmine, the barn strung with strands of soft glowing lights that swayed gently in the breeze, and inside, laughter and music echoed off the wooden beams like something sacred. Laura, in a lace gown that seemed to belong to another era, moved through the crowd like a poem come to life, her auburn hair pinned loosely, cheeks still flushed from her tears during the vows. Daniel Walker, tall and lean with a modest confidence, barely let go of her hand. They were magnetic together, the kind of love you didn't question, but simply felt in your chest when they smiled at each other. It was their first and only dance that would become a memory burned into every heart that witnessed it. They had chosen a classic song, something timeless, and as the first few notes played on the rustic speakers, the room hushed. The crowd parted around them, giving the newlyweds a wide circle under the soft amber lights. And for those few minutes, they moved like no one else existed. There was something serene about it, like watching two souls silently promise each other forever, not just in words, but in the way they leaned into every step, every glance, every soft whisper the rest of the room could only guess at. When the song ended, there was a beat of silence, almost reverent, before the applause erupted and guests clinked glasses and shouted good-natured toasts. But amidst the joy, no one noticed when Laura and Daniel quietly slipped away from the center of the barn, hands still entwined, their smiles still lingering. It wasn't unusual for couples to steal a few minutes alone during a wedding, and so the night carried on, at least for a while. It was nearly half an hour later when someone realized they hadn't returned. At first, it was met with chuckles, probably off somewhere sneaking a kiss or catching their breath. But as time stretched on, people began to feel it in their stomachs, that shift from amusement to unease. The best man went looking, then the moon. The new cast man went looking. Maid of honor, then Laura's younger sister Ellie. The laughter in the barn began to fade as murmurs replaced melodies. The fields around the venue were searched, flashlights bobbing like fireflies in the dark, calling out names that never answered. The car they had arrived in, a borrowed Ford Crown Victoria, still sat in the dirt driveway. No purse, no phone, no jacket left behind. Laura's bouquet was found resting on a bale of hay near the edge of the barn's back entrance, as though placed there deliberately or dropped in haste. The police were called by midnight. By morning, helicopters circled above the nearby woods. Bloodhounds combed the ground, and state troopers joined the effort. But there was nothing. No signs of struggle, no trails of broken branches, no torn clothing or calls for help. Only two pairs of footprints, one belonging to a woman in heels, the other to a man in dress shoes leading away from the barn and into the trees. The prints stopped about 30 feet into the woods, swallowed by dry leaves and soft earth, as if the couple had simply vanished into thin air. Theories bloomed like wildfire. Some whispered they had run away to start a new life, but those who truly knew them, who had seen the way Daniel looked at Laura and how she had wept through her vows, refused to believe it. Others feared something far worse. The woods in Woodpine were old and deep, and there had been stories. Of course, strange lights, eerie sounds, a missing hiker decades before. But this was different. These were two beloved people, newly married and full of joy, with no reason to disappear. And yet, they were gone, as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. The wedding that was supposed to mark the beginning of a life together became the start of a mystery that would hang over Woodpine like a fog no wind could carry away. News. Crews descended upon the town, painting it as a quaint backdrop to a chilling tale. The barn, once a symbol of joy, was closed and locked, left to decay with time. Laura's parents held on to each other like shipwreck survivors, and Daniel's mother began attending church again for the first time in years, her lips always moving in quiet prayer. Ellie, just 17 then, merely spoke for days. No remains. Number notes, no ransom. Just a wedding without a bride and groom. Their faces became frozen in time, smiling eternally from newspaper clippings and missing posters that faded under sun and rain, taped to telephone poles and bulletin boards long. After hope began to dwindle, the town, too small to forget and too proud to accept such a wound, lived in the shadow of that night. People still married in Woodpine, still danced in barns and toasted to love, but there was always that quiet pause when the music slowed, a subtle glance toward the door, a wondering if the past was ever truly buried. The mystery of Laura and Daniel Walker became a part of Woodpine's story, a wound that never healed but simply became part of the landscape, like the hills or the trees or the barn that no one dared tear down. Morning arrived in Woodpine not with birdsong or sunshine, but with sirens and the drone of helicopters slicing through the summer air. As the dew clung to tall blades of grass and the shadows of oaks stretched long and still, the once celebratory air from the night before had soured into something tense and heavy. By 7 o'clock, the entire area surrounding the old barn was crawling with law enforcement officers, volunteers in reflective vests, and reporters with cameras and microphones waiting to turn heartbreak into headlines. Sheriff Dean Holloway, a man not easily shaken after 28 years on the job, stood at the edge of the clearing with a furrowed brow and a silence that said more than words ever could. He had known Laura since she was a child, remembered her toddling through the church hallways and later bagging groceries at Miller's Market after school. He had coached Daniel's Little League team. These weren't just missing persons. They were family in the way small towns bind people to each other. And the way they vanished made no sense to anyone, not even the seasoned officers who arrived from neighboring counties to assist DOP by mid-morning. Search parties were fanning out across the woods in tight formations, voices calling the couples. Names as branches snapped underfoot. Dogs barked, their noses to the ground, zigzagging across terrain damp with last night's rain. The barn itself was combed top to bottom, nothing but crumpled napkins, the leftover smell of cake and champagne, and 2 empty chairs at the bridal table that no one dared to move. The cake mix still lay on the tablecloth, streaked with white. Frosting, untouched since the moment before the dance. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was broken. Their suitcases were still back at Laura's parents' house, neatly packed and waiting for the honeymoon. It was as if the earth had taken them quietly, respectfully, and without resistance. And so the town began to buzz not with gossip, not yet, but with disbelief and an annoying sense that something unnatural had happened on a night meant for joy. Some people whispered of abduction, pointing to strange headlights seen off County Road 9 around midnight. Others remembered old stories from the 60s about a hermit who used to live deep in the woods, though no one could agree on what had become of him. But beneath every theory and suspicion, one truth loomed larger than all. Laura and Daniel had vanished into nothing, and no one could explain it. By noon, news vans had set up along the side of the road, and within hours, Their smiling wedding photo was broadcast to every home in California and beyond. Reporters clutched microphones with solemn faces, asking questions no one could answer. The story spread quickly. Newlyweds disappear without a trace on wedding night. Small town grieves and searches dot at the Walker family home. Laura's mother sat on the porch with hands folded so tightly her knuckles turned white, her eyes never blinking. She was still wearing the corsage from the night before, now wilted and brown around the edges. Laura's father, who had once served in Vietnam, paced in slow, deliberate steps along the edge of the yard, his jaw clenched, every muscle in his body coiled with helplessness. He had seen combat, but nothing like this, not this silence, not this unanswered dread. He wanted to do something, anything, but there was nowhere to aim his anger, no enemy to face. At Daniel's childhood home, his mother clutched the last photograph they had taken of him, the one in his tuxedo, his hand resting gently on Laura's waist, and wept silently, the kind of weeping that doesn't make a sound but leaves everything. Inside shattered Dot, as dusk fell on that long, bewildering day, Woodpine changed. A stillness settled over it, not the peaceful kind, but the sort that felt like waiting for the other shoe to drop. The barn, once glowing with music and laughter, now stood guarded with yellow police tape and floodlights. The road leading to it was closed off, and officers took statements from every guest, staff member, and relative. Everyone was questioned. Where were you standing? Who did you see? Did anyone act strangely? A few people mentioned a power flicker just before the dance, a brief moment when the lights dimmed for a second. Nothing more. One woman, slightly tipsy at the time, claimed she saw a man in a dark coat lingering near the tree line, but her description was vague, and no one else could confirm it. Without solid leads, speculation began to creep in. Rumors spread like ivy through the town. Some whispered that Daniel had cold feet and fled, dragging Laura with him. Others believed the opposite, that Laura had secrets, that she'd wanted to run away all along. But the people who knew them best, teachers, neighbors, friends, dismissed such ideas outright. These weren't impulsive teenagers. They were thoughtful, devoted people. Laura had spent months planning the wedding down to the color of the napkins. Daniel had taken out a loan to buy their first home. Their love wasn't a fairy tale. It was real, grounded, and rooted in years of shared life. The more people talked, the more the town fractured between those holding on to hope and those bracing for a terrible truth. Within a week, the search efforts had expanded beyond the woods, covering nearby lakes, abandoned buildings, even old mine shafts from the gold rush era. Tips came in from across the state. Someone thought they saw them at a gas station 2 towns over. Another claimed a woman matching Laura's description asked for directions in a diner. All were dead ends. Slowly, painfully, the town's search gave way to quiet acceptance. Flyers began curling at the corners on telephone poles. The flowers laid by the barn began to wilt. The sheriff issued a press statement declaring the investigation open, but without leads. And just like that, the mystery solidified into legend. But there were those who never stopped looking, never gave in to the silence. Laura's father spent his mornings walking the forest paths behind the barn, his eyes scanning the soil like it might speak to him. Daniel's brother kept a police scanner by his bed, listening for any clue, no matter how faint. And young Ellie, barely 17 then, promised herself she would not let their story fade like so many missing faces before them. Even as the town began to forget, she held tight to a different truth, that someone knew what had happened that night, and someday, somehow, the forest would give up its secret. In the weeks following the wedding night that turned into a waking nightmare, Woodpine found itself caught in the strange limbo between hope and dread. It was no longer a matter of whether something terrible had happened. Everyone had accepted. That Laura and Daniel had not simply wandered off for a secret honeymoon, but rather a gnawing need to understand what, and more importantly, why. A town once known for its peach harvests and Sunday parades was now reduced to questions, spoken in hushed tones over coffee and cautious glances at strangers who lingered too long. Without any new evidence or fresh clues, people did what they had always done when left in the dark. They began to imagine their own answers. Theories multiplied like ivy across a neglected wall. Some clung to the idea that the couple had been abducted, perhaps by someone who had watched the ceremony unnoticed, waiting for their moment. A few believed it had to be someone from town, someone who knew the layout of the barn, knew where to slip in unseen, maybe even someone who had smiled and danced with them that very evening. Others cast their suspicions outward, suggesting a passing drifter or a pair of criminals using the dense forest as cover. Sheriff Holloway, despite his professionalism, couldn't help but privately consider those darker possibilities. But nothing made sense. The couple's bank accounts remained untouched. There were no ransom notes, no cryptic phone calls. No one bragged in secret. No jailhouse snitch ever mentioned a word. There was a void where answers should have been, and it grew more suffocating with time. Then came the stories, the kind that didn't live in police reports, but found fertile ground in human fear and imagination. An old man who lived near the edge of the woods claimed to have seen a flickering light deep in the trees the night of the wedding, moving too high and too fast for flashlights. A waitress at the diner said she served the man the next morning who smelled like river water and mud, his hands shaking as he paid in crumpled 20s. And then there were the more outlandish whispers. Laura and Daniel caught in some supernatural rift, the ghosts of the land reclaiming them on the night their lives were joined. These were the stories passed down not in newspapers, but around kitchen tables and across bar counters after one too many drinks. Despite the noise, the investigation tried to push forward. Sheriff Holloway brought in specialists from the state cadaver, dogs, forensic anthropologists, even a geospatial analyst who mapped every footstep taken the night of the disappearance. They scoured aerial photographs for signs of disturbed soil, dug up sections of forest with high-end equipment, and brought divers to nearby ponds. But there was nothing, no clothing scraps, no shoe prints beyond the ones already documented. No signs of violence or struggle. It was as if Laura and Daniel had stepped into fog and dissolved. Even their families began to fracture under the weight of so much waiting. Laura's mother grew quiet, her voice barely more than a whisper in the house once filled with music and sunlight. Her father, once tireless in his daily searches, began to show the wear in his body, limping slightly from an old injury, aggravated by months of trudging through uneven ground. Daniel's mother stopped attending church, not out of anger, but exhaustion. Every prayer now felt like asking a question to a God who'd already turned away. His younger brother Adam, just 21 at the time, joined the army not long after, telling friends he needed to get away from a town where everything reminded him of a brother who smiled but never came home. 2 years passed. Then 3. And slowly, as inevitably as seasons change, Woodpine began to let go. The missing posters turned yellow and peeled in the rain. The barn was eventually sold to an out-of-town developer who intended to turn it into a winery, though nothing ever came of it. The investigation was never formally closed, but it settled into the filing cabinet of forgotten things, growing dusty as new cases pushed it further down the stack. Every so often, someone would come forward with a memory they thought might help, or an anonymous letter would arrive claiming to know something, none of it credible. One man swore he had seen the couple hitchhiking near the Nevada border. Another insisted he saw Laura's wedding dress in a pawn shop window in Reno. But every tip collapsed under scrutiny, each one another false light on the horizon. There was, however, one person who refused to let time erase the truth. Ellie Bennett, Laura's younger sister, had watched her world collapse at 17 and found within herself a resolve far older than her years. While others gave in to the numbness, she fed her grief like fuel, turning it into a fire that kept her moving forward. After graduating high school, she studied journalism, not for fame or career, but for tools. She wanted to learn how to ask better questions, how to track down people, how to make sure no one could hide behind silence. She kept a thick binder, filled with every detail from that night, every name, every timeline, every rumor, every failure. She believed, deep in her bones, that someone had seen something. Someone had made a choice that night and had managed to live with it. But she wouldn't let that last forever. What made the mystery even more cruel was how full of life Laura and Daniel had been. People remembered them not for the tragedy, but for their laughter, their shared joy, how Daniel used to bring her wildflowers on Sundays, and how Laura would leave little notes in his lunchbox during his long shifts at the garage. They were the kind of people you assumed would grow old together, buy a house with a big porch, raise kids with the same freckles and crooked smiles. That future had been taken in an instant, and no one knew by whom. So, as the years went by, the questions remained, hovering like mist above the forest where their footprints had vanished. What could have happened in the 30 minutes between their dance and the moment someone noticed they were gone? Who else had been watching them that night, unseen? And what secret lay buried beneath the surface of a town that had always seemed so safe? Ellie didn't have the answers yet, but she wasn't finished asking. And as the 10th anniversary of the disappearance approached, something new, something entirely unexpected was about to surface. And it would begin not with a scream or a confession, but with the quiet whir of a drone rising into the sky. Time is a strange thing in small towns. It doesn't pass like it does in the bustling cities or the busy lives of strangers. In Woodpine, time lingers in the spaces between moments, like a cup of coffee that cools slowly on a kitchen table. For the first few years after Laura and Daniel vanished, the town was a place of mourning, a place where every corner, every familiar face, seemed weighed down by the absence of two people who had once been the beating heart of its community. The barn, where their love had once blossomed so brightly, stood silently in the distance, an ever-present reminder of the night that changed everything. But as much as they wanted to, as much as they tried, the people of Woodpine couldn't stay in the past forever. Families moved into the homes that had once belonged to those most affected by the disappearance. The Walkers' old house was sold, a fresh coat of paint covering the windows where Laura used to sit on summer afternoons. The town square, where neighbors had once gathered for festivals and harvest celebrations, grew crowded with new faces. People who hadn't lived through the heartbreak, people who had no idea about the story that haunted Woodpine. There were still quiet moments, though, little pockets of memory where the past wouldn't quite let go. At the diner, for example, the elderly couple who ran the counter still made an extra coffee every morning at 6 a.m. and set it on the table near the window, as if they were waiting for someone to sit down. For a long time, they would not speak of it, of what had happened to Laura and Daniel. They didn't need to. The empty chair was enough of a reminder. But as the years went on, the mystery faded, as mysteries tend to do when they go unsolved. Woodpine, for all its rich history, began to rebuild itself in the absence of its lost children. People stopped asking the hard questions, stopped pushing for answers that seemed too impossible to ever be found. Life, for better or worse, moved forward. Some thought it was healthier to let the tragedy drift away with time, to let the town breathe again without the constant reminder of the past. New weddings took place in the same barn, though now with a slightly more somber tone, and laughter again filled the air, if only for a while. The anniversaries passed quietly, each one marked by a brief moment of silence, a quick prayer, and then the usual routine of life taking over. Woodpine was healing, but the scars remained beneath the surface, hidden by the veil of normality. Ellie Bennett, now in her 20s, returned to Woodpine only rarely. After high school, she had left for college, then later moved to Sacramento for work. She knew, deep in her bones, that she couldn't stay in the town that had stolen her sister away. It wasn't the people of Woodpine. It was the town itself, the smell of the dirt, the breeze that seemed to carry her sister's laughter in the air. Everything that reminded her of Laura, of what was missing, and she needed space to breathe. Yet, no matter how far she went, no matter how much she tried to build a life that was separate, the memory of Laura and Daniel always hovered just outside her periphery. She had unfinished business. The kind that gnaws at your gut, the kind that keeps you awake at night with questions that won't die. No matter how many years passed thought in Sacramento, Ellie had started working as a journalist. At first, it was a way to pay the bills, but soon, it became a way to process her grief. Writing, researching, piecing together broken stories, this was how she kept herself afloat. But no matter how successful she became, no matter how many stories she published, none of them felt important. They were all just distractions. She didn't care about politics or sensationalized crimes. What she wanted was answers. She wanted to know what had happened to her sister, and more than that, she wanted the town to know too. She couldn't let go. She refused to. On the 10th anniversary of the disappearance, Ellie returned to Woodpine. It was a decision she had been wrestling with for months. She was tired of running from the past, tired of ignoring the truth. Maybe she could finally find the closure she had been searching for all these years. She reached out to a few old friends, people she hadn't spoken to in ages, and made plans to attend a small memorial that had been organized by a few of the old residents. It wasn't much, just a few flowers left by the barn, some quiet prayers. But it was enough. Ellie needed to be there, needed to feel that connection again, even if it was painful. When she arrived in Woodpine, it was almost exactly as she remembered. It quiet, with the same dusty air and the same old brick buildings lining the main street. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery, mixed with the earthy scent of pine trees. The town hadn't changed much in the years she had been gone, and that was both comforting and disheartening. It was as if time had stood still in this place, while the rest of the world moved on. She parked her car near the edge of the barn and got out, her heart heavy with the weight of the past. As she stood there, looking at the familiar structure, a deep pang of loss hit her. But it wasn't just grief, it was a sense of injustice, of a life that had been stolen without reason. Ellie wandered around the barn, staring at the cracked pavement and the overgrown weeds that had crept through the cracks. She could almost hear the echoes of the wedding bells, the laughter, the music. It felt like a dream, like something she had imagined but could never really touch. She walked to the edge of the forest, where the trees lined the path that had once been the last place her sister and Daniel had been seen. The air was thick with silence, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. Ellie bent down and touched the earth, as if somehow she could connect with whatever secret was buried there. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the memories flood her mind. Then, in the quiet, she made a decision she wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. Not ever again. The next day, she would return to the one place where the search had never stopped. The one place where someone might still know something. Someone had to know. And for the first time in years, Ellie felt the flicker of hope rekindle inside her heart. This town, this place that had tried to forget, was about to be reminded of something they could never truly erase. Ellie sat at the edge of her childhood bed, its frame slightly creaking under her as the soft morning light spilled through the faded curtains. The house felt smaller than she remembered, and emptier, though her parents had done their best to Keep it warm with fresh flowers in the vases and pictures of Laura and Daniel still proudly displayed on the hallway walls. Her mother had aged noticeably, her once dark hair now a soft gray, and her father walked slower, his posture bent by time and the ache of unanswered grief. They hadn't asked too many questions when Ellie announced her visit. It was enough for them to know she was home again, even if they both silently wondered what she had come back to find. But Ellie knew the answer, even if she couldn't say it out loud yet. She had returned not for memories, but for a feeling she couldn't shake, something deep and urgent that had been pulling at her ever since she'd stood by the barn and touched the earth. For years she had combed through the case files, news clippings and first-hand accounts, building timelines and theories and maps with pins and strings like a detective out of a movie. But what she needed now wasn't more paper or archived interviews. She needed to see it all again with fresh eyes. She needed to be on the ground, to walk the space as if she were the one who had vanished, to look where others hadn't looked, or perhaps had looked too long ago with eyes that couldn't see past their assumptions. She started with a visit to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Holloway had retired 5 years prior, but his successor, a younger man named Clay Barnes, knew the legend of the vanished newlyweds as well as anyone raised in Woodpine. He greeted Ellie with a polite warmth, though she could see the cautious curiosity behind his eyes. Everyone did when they recognized her. She was the sister who had never let the story die. Clay led her into a back office where dusty boxes filled with files from the original investigation were stored, their corners yellowed and brittle, the tabs marked with fading ink. They spent hours sifting through records, photographs of the scene, transcriptions of witness statements, maps hand-drawn on graph paper, and reports from outside agencies. Ellie noticed something curious, a consistent 20-minute gap in nearly every statement, the time between when Laura and Daniel finished their dance and when someone first noticed their absence. No one could account for that window, not specifically. There were vague recollections. Someone remembered seeing Laura near the back door of the barn. Someone else recalled Daniel laughing with the best man near the punch table, but the accounts were fuzzy, muddled by time and the wine-soaked joy of the night. Still, that gap nagged at Ellie. What could happen in 20 minutes that would erase two people completely? She decided to retrace their last known movements. That afternoon, she returned to the barn alone, parking near the fence line and stepping carefully over the rustic gate. The place hadn't changed much since she'd seen it a few days earlier, though now it felt more like a stage, each corner holding the ghost of a scene no one could remember clearly. She walked the perimeter of the barn, following the side path that led into the trees, careful to stay on the same route where their footprints had once been recorded. The deeper she moved into the forest, the quieter the world became. It wasn't the quiet of peace, but the kind of silence that makes your skin prick, as if the woods themselves were listening. Ellie stopped near a cluster of moss-covered stones and looked up through the break in the canopy above. That's when the idea struck her. Not a memory, not a sudden revelation, but something almost absurd in its simplicity. What if the answers weren't in the ground anymore? What if they had always been just above them, hidden in the treetops and unseen terrain? In the early 80s, search efforts had been conducted entirely by foot and helicopter-limited views, blind spots, areas too dense to examine thoroughly. But now it was 2003, and the world had changed. Technology had evolved. She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving quickly as she looked up drone operators in the county. There were more than she expected: hobbyists, surveyors, a few students at the local community college. She sent 3 emails that night and made 2 calls the next morning. Only one person got back to her right away. His name was Trevor Hanley, a 30-something drone enthusiast who had moved back to Woodpine after living in Oregon. He was intrigued not just by the story, he knew it, of course, but by the chance to use his skills for something more meaningful than real estate footage and wedding videos. They met the next morning just after sunrise. Ellie showed him the path, the general area where Laura and Daniel had last been seen, and together they watched as the drone rose smoothly into the air, its soft hum cutting through the stillness, like the voice of something long dormant. The first few flights yielded nothing but beauty-sweeping views of the tree canopy, glimpses of wildlife darting through shadows, the faded roof of the barn barely visible through the branches. But on the third flight, something shifted. As the drone hovered farther north, its camera picked up a strange pattern in the forest floor, an unusual depression just past a natural clearing, where the trees parted into what looked like a gully. The shape wasn't natural. It was too rectangular, too symmetrical, partially hidden beneath moss and leaf litter. Trevor slowed the drone, zoomed in, tilted the angle of the shot. Beneath the foliage, there was the unmistakable sheen of metal dull, rusted, barely catching the light, but undeniably there. Ellie stared at the screen, her heart racing. She didn't say a word. She couldn't. The silence between them was loud with possibility, and in that moment, she knew that something long buried had just whispered its first secret in decades. The soft mechanical hum of the drone blended with the wind rustling through the high branches as Ellie stood still, eyes locked on the screen fixed to Trevor's controller. Neither of them spoke at first. There was a weight to the moment, as if saying anything aloud might scare away whatever revelation was perched quietly on the edge of their discovery. The forest on the monitor was bathed in early morning light, filtered in gold through the high canopy. But what caught their attention wasn't the beauty. It was the foreign shape half swallowed by the woods. It wasn't large, not something visible from the road or easily noticeable from a casual walk through the trees. But once the drone paused over it and began a slow circular hover, the image grew clearer. A rusted, rectangular object buried just beneath a layer of moss and soil, surrounded by scattered rocks and the long, snaking shadows of trees. It wasn't trash. It wasn't a natural formation. It was something man-made. Trevor slowly brought the drone in closer, lowering its altitude in careful, practiced movements. The camera tilted downward at a steep angle, revealing more of the strange surface, a sheen of corroded metal, flaked with patches of green and brown, but unmistakably part of some kind of vehicle. As the lens focused, Ellie's breath caught. There, barely distinguishable beneath the grime and decay, was the faint outline of what could only be a taillight, small, red, cracked, and nearly overtaken by moss. She didn't need more than that. In her bones, she knew. This wasn't some abandoned hunting shed or forgotten scrap of farm equipment. It was a car hidden deep in the forest, far off any mapped trail, and in exactly the same area where Laura and Daniel's footprints had disappeared all those years ago. Trevor glanced up from the screen, his brows lifted in quiet shock. "That's not supposed to be there," he said, more to himself than to her. Ellie didn't respond. She stepped away from him, walking toward the tree line, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. Her heart was pounding, every step driven by the mix of hope and dread that had haunted her since she was 17. She hadn't come back to Woodpine looking for this, not exactly. But now that it was here, she felt the full weight of what it might mean. "Can you mark the location?" she asked without turning around. Trevor nodded and tapped the screen, saving the GPS coordinates and setting the drone into hover mode as it rose higher to maintain its signal. They spent the next 20 minutes walking carefully through the underbrush, guided by the data and Trevor's screen, adjusting their path with every landmark matched against the drone's angle. The hike wasn't long, but the terrain was difficult and uneven, covered in roots and slippery leaves, the kind of landscape that made it easy to fall and hard to be found. Which, Ellie thought might explain why no one had found it before. Eventually, they reached a slope that dipped into a shallow hollow lined with old pine needles and silence. And there, barely visible under a mess of natural camouflage, was the truth that had evaded Woodpine for a decade. The car was almost entirely sunken into the forest floor. Its frame was rusted and bent. The windshield collapsed inward. Vines crawling through the cracks and curling along the dashboard like accusing fingers. Nature had been working to erase it, season by season. Ellie stepped forward slowly, crouching near the rear bumper. She brushed her hand against the moss, pulling it back gently, revealing what remained of a license plate bent, faded, but still legible. Her breath caught again. It was their car. The Ford Crown Victoria they had left the ceremony in. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a false lead. This was real. Trevor stood behind her, quiet, respectful. "Should we call the police?" he asked after a long silence. Ellie nodded, though her throat was tight with emotion. "Yeah," she whispered. "We have to." She stepped back and pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed. "The sheriff's office." Her voice, when she spoke, was calm but hollow. She gave the location, her name, told them they needed to send someone immediately, that they had found the car from the 1993 disappearance of Laura and Daniel Walker. The dispatcher grew quiet after Ellie said the names. Everyone in Woodpine still remembered. Within an hour, deputies were on site, followed closely by Sheriff Barnes. He took one look at the wreckage and knew this was something that could no longer be ignored or filed away. The area was taped off and the car examined carefully. Forensics teams arrived from the county center with gloves and cameras and tools meant to extract truth from silence. The work was delicate. They couldn't afford to destroy any evidence after so much time had passed. As the investigators gently cleared more of the debris, Ellie stood to the side, watching, feeling as if she were both inside her own body and outside of it at the same time. The forest had kept this secret for 10 years, sealed under leaves, and rain and time. And now, finally, it was speaking. One of the deputies, a woman with sharp eyes and steady hands, opened the driver's side door. It creaked with the strain of rust, letting out a moan that sounded too human. Inside, the front seats were shredded by time, but in the center console, sealed in a rusted compartment, they found something that made everyone freeze. A wedding band, delicate and unmistakably feminine, engraved on the inside. Sheriff Barnes picked it up with gloved hands, his jaw clenched. He didn't have to ask whose it was. It was Laura's. The initials matched the ones from the original report, etched inside that small circle of gold. There was no doubt now. They had found something real, something undeniable. As the sun began to dip below the horizon once more, casting long shadows over the scene, Ellie felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow settle over her. She had always known the answers were out there. And now, with one drone flight and one buried car, the truth was finally beginning to crack through the surface of Woodpine silence. But deep down, she understood this wasn't the end of the mystery. This was only the beginning of what the woods had been hiding all along. The following morning arrived beneath a low sky, gray and uncertain, as if the heavens themselves were withholding judgment. Rain had fallen overnight, not in torrents, but enough to soften the earth and shroud the woods in mist. The discovery of the car had turned what was once a buried local myth into something undeniable and terrifyingly real. News spread through Woodpine like a pulse, steady and inevitable, awakening the town from its carefully preserved amnesia. The sheriff's office erected a broader perimeter around the site, and law enforcement from neighboring counties joined the effort. Deputies moved with cautious urgency, combing through the undergrowth with gloved hands and sharp eyes, no longer just looking for memories. They were looking for evidence, for truth long denied. Ellie stood quietly near the edge of the scene, arms crossed tightly across her chest, watching as the forest gave up more of its silence, piece by piece. The excavation was slow, hampered by a decade's worth of decay. The car had shifted slightly into the earth, its undercarriage warped and twisted by time. Technicians carefully removed layers of organic matter that had worked their way into the frame, while specialists took photographs from every angle before touching a single piece of what remained. Inside, they found remnants that once might have been clothing-faded fabric fibers clinging to seat cushions, a single shoe wedged under the passenger side. But it wasn't until they pulled back the shattered rear seat panel that they uncovered something that made everyone fall still. Bones, not scattered or crushed but eerily intact, folded in a way that spoke of containment, of someone trying to hide rather than escape. There were two sets, confirmed almost immediately by the forensic team, both adults. One appeared to be seated behind the driver, the other crumpled low on the floor beneath the passenger side. Sheriff Barnes stepped back as the team worked, his face pale. It was clear that the discovery, even after all the years of distance and retelling, had hit him hard. He wasn't just a public official today. He was a man bearing witness to the ghosts of people he had once seen dancing in that old barn, like they had the rest of their lives ahead of them. Ellie felt a hollowness settle in her chest as she stared at the remains. She had imagined this moment before, in dreams and waking fantasies during long drives, in the quiet hours of grief, but now that it was real, it felt cruel in its finality. There would be no miraculous reunion, no secret escape, no hidden life in some faraway place. Laura and Daniel had died that night, not metaphorically, not in story, but in the most physical, tragic sense. And the forest had cradled them in silence for 10 long years. As the bones were carefully catalogued and removed, another discovery emerged, one that raised more questions than it answered. Just a few feet from the car, buried beneath a shallow mound of disturbed soil, was a second object, a small, rusted toolbox with a broken latch and a faint red smear along its side. Inside were several items: an old hunting knife wrapped in weathered cloth, a key that didn't match the car, and a black and white photograph folded into quarters, brittle at the seams. Ellie took one glance at the photo and felt her breath hitch. It was Laura and Daniel, but not from their wedding. It was older, maybe a year or two before, taken in front of Daniel's garage. They were smiling, casual, unposed. The photo looked like it had been taken by someone close, someone who knew them well, and someone who had wanted to keep it. That toolbox changed everything. The knife, in particular, showed signs of old bloodstains, oxidized and faded, but still traceable. Preliminary tests hinted at human DNA, though the results would take time. Sheriff Barnes looked at Ellie with a mix of sympathy and fear. This wasn't just an accident, he said quietly, almost to himself. Someone left this here. Someone wanted it to stay hidden. The implications were enormous. The long-accepted theories of the couple getting lost, of a tragic wrong turn or a freak disappearance, now seemed woefully inadequate. Someone had done this to them. Someone had made sure they would never be found. Back at the sheriff's office, Ellie was given a temporary pass to review the evidence logs. She flipped through the new entries with trembling fingers, her mind racing to connect threads that had once seemed too faint to follow. The photo, the knife, the location, all of it pointed not just to violence, but to familiarity. This hadn't been random. Whoever had taken Laura and Daniel had known them, had watched them, had likely been among the guests that night, maybe. Even smiled and clapped as they shared their first dance. That thought made Ellie sick. She pictured every face from the wedding, every handshake, every voice from that evening that still echoed in her memory. One of them had harbored a secret darker than anyone could have imagined. The forest, now buzzing with investigators, felt like a crime scene caught in a dream. Lights were strung between trees, generators humming in the distance, voices low and clipped. But beneath it all, Ellie sensed something else, an energy, a shift, as if the woods had finally decided to yield the truth. She walked the perimeter again that evening, long after most had gone home. The breeze was cool against her skin, carrying the scent of pine and wet soil. As she stood there, she thought about how long her sister must have lain beneath those leaves, unknown and unmourned. She felt a rage begin to burn low and steady in her chest, not loud or explosive, but focused. This wasn't over. It wasn't even close. Someone had taken Laura and Daniel's lives and had lived free for 10 years. That wouldn't last, thought as Ellie turned to leave. She caught a glimpse of something near the base of a tree, a small silver object half buried in the dirt. She bent down and picked it up. It was a charm, the kind that might hang from a bracelet or necklace, shaped like a tiny locket with initials etched into the back door. Her hands trembled as she closed her fist. Around it, Daniel Walker, another breadcrumb, another piece in a puzzle that was no longer content to stay buried. The forest had revealed its first secrets, but it was far from finished. Ellie looked up into the canopy, the trees swaying gently in the darkening light, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel entirely alone. She felt seen, and that changed everything. In the days that followed the discovery of the car and the skeletal remains, Woodpine shifted once more, this time not into grief, but into something sharper, more electric. It was as if a town that had long accepted its ghosts was now realizing those ghosts had names and possibly faces, walking among them all these years. News crews came and went, their vans parked like vultures near the sheriff's office. Cameras pointed at the town's pain, always ready to frame a tragedy as spectacle. But Ellie didn't care about them. Her focus had narrowed. Something about the photo in the toolbox had lodged deep in her brain, more than the car, more than even the bones. That photo, worn and folded, had been taken by someone who had once stood very close to Laura and Daniel, someone who had chosen to keep it, to hide it, perhaps as a keepsake, or perhaps as a cruel memento. Whoever had taken it hadn't been a stranger. She went back to her binder that night, the one she'd carried since college, filled with copies of every record she could find, guest lists, seating charts, candid photographs from the wedding, old phone records, property maps, and handwritten notes. It was all there, worn and tattered, but intact. She spread everything across the dining room table in her parents' house, the same table where Laura had once carved her initials into the underside during a long summer afternoon. Ellie moved methodically, pinning strings from the photo to names, from names to addresses, and then finally something clicked. It wasn't just the photo that mattered. It was the angle, the height, the composition. The photographer had been standing on a low hill outside Daniel's garage, a place not easily accessed without permission. The image wasn't candid in the accidental sense. It had been taken deliberately by someone who had been welcomed. Ellie sifted through the wedding guest list once more, her eyes scanning names for anyone who might have been close enough to capture such a moment. And then she saw it. 2 names that had always seemed like background figures, Norman and Celeste Avery. Daniel had worked part-time at Norman's auto shop before opening his own. And though they hadn't been especially close in the months leading up to the wedding, Norman had still been invited. What stood out now, however, was a short note Laura had written next to Celeste's name in her planning notebook. Daniel says she gives him the creeps. Try to seat her far from us if possible. Ellie remembered brushing past that line before, dismissing it as a bride's pre-wedding anxiety. But now, in this new light, it burned with a deeper significance that the Averys had left Woodpine a year after the disappearance. At the time, it hadn't seemed suspicious. Norman had shuttered his shop quietly, citing financial stress, and they'd moved north to Idaho. Ellie remembered hearing the name during her early interviews, but had never followed up. Now she wondered why. The photo, the knife, the proximity. It was enough to merit more than just curiosity. She called Sheriff Barnes that evening and laid out what she had found. To his credit, he didn't dismiss it. "We'll look into it," he promised, his voice tight, quietly. Ellie hung up with her pulse hammering. She didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to think that someone who had danced at the wedding, who had clinked glasses and hugged Laura goodbye, had been the same person to follow them into the dark. The next day, the sheriff's team quietly contacted Idaho authorities. It didn't take long to locate the Averys. They were living in a small town outside Boise, renting a modest house and working odd jobs. Norman did car repairs from his garage, cash only. Celeste volunteered at a local thrift store. Their lives seemed ordinary, almost painfully so. But something about the simplicity read false to Ellie, as if it had been manufactured, lived too quietly for too long. Sheriff Barnes, sensing the need for discretion, decided not to confront them directly. Instead, he asked for DNA samples from the knife and the fibers found in the trunk. If Norman or Celeste had touched that knife or handled the fabric, it would show up. Ellie waited, checking in every morning like clockwork, each day stretching into the next with unbearable slowness. Then, after nearly 2 weeks, the call came. The preliminary DNA results were in. The knife bore traces of both Laura and Daniels. Blood, but more than that, latent prints, long degraded, had been reconstructed just enough for partial matches. The lab had found a 92% match to Norman Avery. It wasn't enough for an immediate arrest, but it was enough to dig deeper. Sheriff Barnes requested a search warrant, citing new evidence tied to a cold case. The Idaho authorities executed it 2 days later, and what they found in Norman's garage unraveled the lie that had been carefully maintained for a decade. Hidden behind a false wall, wrapped in a layer of moldy insulation, was a box of belongings, old photographs, notes, even pieces of Laura's wedding veil. The same handwriting that labeled oil filters and spark plug bins had also scribbled names and dates. One note read, "She always smiled at him. He didn't deserve her." The words sent a chill down Ellie's spine when she read them later. In the official report, the motive became clearer. Jealousy, obsession, perhaps something darker. No one knew the full truth, yet not whether it had been premeditated or a crime of passion. Not whether Celeste had known or helped. But Norman Avery had been there. He had known them. He had waited until the moment was right, until the celebration was loud and wild, and the barn lights flickered like fireflies. And then he had followed them into the trees. The past that had seemed so unreachable was now coming into focus. And for the first time in 10 years, the possibility of justice felt real. But justice alone wouldn't heal the wound. Ellie knew that. She sat again at the table that night. Binder open, papers scattered like ash. The hidden connection had been there all along, in the margins, in the forgotten lines of an old notebook, in the backs of photos developed and stuffed into drawers. It had taken a decade to see it clearly. And as she closed the binder, she whispered Laura's name, not as a plea, but as a promise. The truth was rising now. And soon, the whole town would have to face what it had chosen to forget. The sun had barely broken over the horizon when Ellie pulled her coat tight against the cool Idaho morning and stepped out of the rented sedan. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of stillness that came with towns too small to make noise before. Breakfast. There were children's bicycles tipped over in driveways, an old dog asleep on a porch across the street, wind chimes barely stirring in the breeze. The Avery house stood at the end of a cul-de-sac like any other modest, unremarkable. Beige siding with peeling paint, a garage door stained with oil streaks and years of neglect. But beneath its bland exterior lay the truth she had chased for over a decade. Norman Avery lived inside, and for the first time since the wedding, Ellie was going to look him in the eyes. Sheriff Barnes had made it clear she wasn't supposed to come. The investigation was active, warrants had been executed, and the case was now in the hands of the district attorney. But that logic, cold and distant, hadn't been enough to keep her from buying a plane ticket and showing up anyway. This wasn't about procedure. This was about standing in front of the man who had destroyed 2 lives and stolen 10 years from hers. She had thought for days about what she would say, had written and rewritten speeches in her head, imagined shouting, imagined slapping him, imagined saying nothing at all. But now, standing on the sidewalk just feet from the door, all of that vanished. There was only the sound of her own heartbeat and the weight of what she carried. She walked up the steps slowly, her boots crunching softly on the gravel path. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorbell. She pressed it once, then stepped back, waiting. The chime echoed faintly inside, and for a long moment, there was no answer. Then, the curtain beside the door shifted. A figure appeared, partially shadowed, and then the door creaked open. Norman Avery stood in the frame, older than in the photos she'd studied, his face weathered by time, beard graying at the edges, eyes sunken. But something in those eyes made her stomach turn. It wasn't fear, or surprise, or even shame. It was recognition. Cold and clear. "I wondered when you come," he said, voice rough like gravel dragged across concrete. Ellie didn't respond right away. Her throat was dry, her chest tight. She studied him, memorizing every detail. How he leaned slightly to one side, how his hands trembled just enough to betray his age, or maybe his nerves. "You knew who I was?" she finally asked, voice steadier than she expected. "I knew. The second I saw you walk up the driveway," he said. "You've got her eyes, Laura's." Her body stiffened at the sound of her sister's name on his lips. It felt profane, like something beautiful being touched by something rotten. "Don't say her name," she snapped. "Not after what you did." He looked away then, his gaze falling to the ground. "You came here for answers," he said quietly. "So ask." Ellie hesitated. So many questions swirled in her mind, but none of them felt big enough. None of them could contain the weight of what he had taken. Still, she forced the words out. "Why? Why them? Why that night?" Norman didn't answer right away. He stepped back into the house and left a door open, a silent invitation. Ellie paused, then followed. The air inside was musty, heavy with old smoke and something metallic. The living room was cluttered with outdated furniture and papers stacked in haphazard piles. On a shelf, she saw photographs, most old, some new, but none of Laura or Daniel. Not anymore. He sat slowly in a frayed armchair and motioned for her to take the opposite seat. She did, but remained on the edge, as if touching anything might tether her to this place longer than necessary. He rubbed his hands together and exhaled deeply, like a man preparing to unearth something long buried. "I loved her," he said. "Finally, from the moment she first came into the shop with Daniel. She smiled at me like I mattered, like I was someone worth knowing. Daniel, he didn't deserve that. He was just a boy with a pretty face. He didn't see her. Ellie's jaw clenched. She loved him. They were happy. "I know," he said, almost wistfully. "That's what made it unbearable." He spoke slowly, unraveling the twisted story like someone confessing to a dream gone wrong. How he had followed them that night, watched from the tree line as they left the barn and walked into the forest for a quiet moment alone. How he had confronted them, not with rage at first, but desperation. He had wanted her to choose, to understand. But things escalated. Daniel had stepped forward, angry, protective. Norman panicked. He had brought the knife. He wasn't sure why, maybe as insurance, maybe to scare him. But it turned real, far, too quickly. The memory, he said, was hazy now. He remembered blood, shouting, Lara screaming. He hadn't meant to kill them. But once it had started, there was no way back. He had driven their bodies in their car to that hollow and buried it all metal. Memories, guilt. Ellie sat frozen, every muscle in her body locked. His words sounded practiced, but not remorseful. There was no sorrow, no apology. Just a man, trying to unburden himself now that the end was near. She looked at him, this small, tired man who had loomed like a shadow over her life for so long, and all she felt was emptiness. You watch people suffer for years, she said bitterly. You let us all believe they just vanished. He shrugged, eyes flat. No one would have believed the truth. I would have, she whispered. I would have fought for it. He looked at her then, something dark and unreadable passing through his gaze. You did. She stood, the weight of his confession pressing hard against her chest. She didn't need anything more. The authorities would finish what had been started. The justice system would now do what it should have done 10 years ago. But she had done what mattered most, looked into the face of the past, and refused to flinch as she walked back out into the morning light. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves across the pavement. For the first time in years, her heart felt unburdened, if only slightly. The man who had stolen her sister's life would face the consequences. But more than that, Ellie had reclaimed something, her voice, her truth. And in that quiet victory, there was power. The courtroom was quiet in a way that held tension like a drawn breath. Every creak of the wooden benches, every scrape of a pen against paper echoed with a kind of reverence usually reserved for churches and funerals. Ellie sat near the front, hands clasped tightly in her lap, the skin along her knuckles pale from the pressure. It had taken months to get here, months of hearings, paperwork, motions filed, and arguments over admissibility. But now the trial had begun, and the weight of justice, long delayed, finally had a place to land. Norman Avery entered the room, flanked by deputies, thinner now, more stooped. His beard trimmed but unable to conceal the lines age and guilt had carved into his face. He looked around the courtroom without expression, his gaze never settling long on any one person, especially not on Ellie. She didn't care. She wasn't here for his attention. She was here for Lara. The prosecution opened their case with quiet force, a narrative measured and precise. They laid out the facts like bricks in a wall. The discovery of the vehicle, the wedding band, the photograph hidden in the rusted toolbox, the partial fingerprints on the knife, and the cache of stolen mementos found behind Norman's garage wall. They brought in forensic experts who spoke in careful, clinical terms about the DNA traces found on the blade, about the likelihood of decomposition in the forest, about the condition of the remains and the objects recovered with them. Ellie listened to every word as though it were being spoken into her bones. She had known the truth for so long, had lived with it pressing against her ribs like a second heartbeat. But hearing it spoken aloud in that room made it more than real. It made it shared. No longer hers to carry alone. The defense, for their part, tried to carve cracks into the story. They questioned the reliability of the old evidence, the chain of custody, the decades of degradation that might have muddied results. They painted Norman as a man broken by time, confused, perhaps manipulated by memory. But what they could never explain was motive. They avoided it like a wound they didn't dare touch, because no one in that courtroom believed Norman's hands were clean, and no one, especially not Ellie, would let them forget what he had done. When she was called to testify, she stepped into the witness box with slow, deliberate steps. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind so many times she could have recited it backward. But now, with the jury watching and her parents behind her, and Laura's memory heavy in her throat. She spoke with raw clarity. She told them about the wedding, the laughter, the lights strung from barn beams, the way Laura had leaned into Daniel during their first dance like nothing in the world could touch them. She described the hours and days that followed their disappearance, the ache of silence, the way the town's smiles curdled into pity. She spoke of her search, of the years spent combing records and retracing steps, of the forest that had held its breath for a decade, and of the moment the drone revealed what they had all missed. She described the photograph, the knife, the charm, the box in the garage, and then she told them about the meeting, about the morning she stood face to face with the man who had taken her sister's life. Her voice didn't shake. She gave them every word, every detail, like stones laid in a path. When she finished, the room was so quiet it felt like time had paused. Then the judge nodded as she stepped down, each step lighter than the one before. Outside, the town was watching. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, their microphones like open mouths, waiting for a soundbite, for closure, for blood. But Ellie didn't speak to them. She had said all she needed to say inside. The trial continued for several days, a parade of evidence and testimony, expert opinions and legal arguments. But the truth, once spoken, carried its own momentum. The jury deliberated for only 7 hours. When they returned, the courtroom stood still once more. The foreman stood, cleared his throat, and read the verdict guilty on all counts. Murder in the first degree, tampering with evidence, concealment of a body. The words didn't bring celebration. No one cheered. Ellie didn't cry. It was not joy she felt, but release. A door finally shut, a chapter sealed with something. Like finality, the judge's sentence followed 2 weeks later. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Norman Avery would spend the rest of his days in a concrete box, watched, forgotten, exactly as he had tried to make Laura and Daniel disappear. Justice, in the legal sense, had been done. But justice in Ellie's heart was different. It came, not from seeing him shackled, but from knowing he could no longer deny the lives he had stolen. From knowing the town had stopped whispering and started listening. From knowing Laura's name was now spoken not as a question, but as a story told with reverence, with grief, with truth. After the sentencing, Ellie returned to the barn one last time. It had been repaired since that long-ago night, but some of the original beams still stood, weathered and proud. She brought 2 lanterns and placed them where Laura and Daniel had danced their first and last dance. She lit them at dusk, their warm glow cutting through the gathering dark like small stars returned to Earth. She stood there for a long time, letting the memories come and go, not holding them too tightly, letting them be what they were. Beautiful, bittersweet, unfinished. She thought of her parents, of how their eyes had softened since the trial, of the way her father had finally begun to play the piano again in the evenings, how her mother had hung Laura's portrait in the hallway instead of hiding it away. She thought of the town, of the people who now nodded at her with more than pity, with a kind of respect earned only through fire. And she thought of herself, not as the girl who had spent her life searching, but as the woman who had finally found what mattered most. As the sky turned violet above the barn and the lanterns flickered quietly, Ellie whispered a final thank you into the wind. Not to anyone in particular, but to the journey itself. To the pain that had shaped her, to the truth that had waited, patient and hidden, until someone brave enough had refused to stop digging. The trial was over. The sentence was passed. And justice, long asleep, had finally begun to move. In the quiet weeks that followed the sentencing, a different kind of stillness settled over Woodpine. Not the oppressive hush of mourning that had hung in the air for a decade, nor the jittery tension of a town drowning in rumor and speculation. This stillness was softer, reflective, like a field lying fallow after a storm. Ellie felt it in the way the townspeople greeted her now, with steady eyes and a quiet respect that came not from pity, but from a shared understanding. They no longer avoided her in the grocery store or turned their backs during community meetings. They asked questions. They listened. And in that shift, Ellie sensed something beginning to change, not just in them, but in herself. She spent the first few mornings waking without the weight that had haunted her every dawn for 10 years. The ache was still there, of course grief, she had learned, never truly vanished, but it no longer wrapped around her like chains. She could walk through the woods now and not flinch at every shadow. She could speak Laura's name aloud without, her voice cracking. But most of all, she could remember. Freely, fully. The sharp edges of pain had softened into something bearable, something that could coexist with love and with memory. One crisp Saturday morning, Ellie stood before the empty lot where her sister and Daniel had planned to build their first home. The land was still untouched, a gentle rise near the base of the woods, wildflowers blooming in reckless swaths across the clearing. The foundation had never been poured. The dream had never been realized. But Ellie saw something else there now, possibility. She reached into her bag and pulled out the envelope she had carried for weeks, the one that contained the deed papers, approved permits, and a handwritten proposal. It hadn't been easy to get through the zoning board, but with the public support that followed the trial, the council had voted unanimously in her favor. She was going to build something, not for herself, but for them. For Laura, for Daniel, and for every family who had ever waited in the dark with questions that never found answers. The building would be simple, beautiful, filled with light and warmth. A place for people to gather, to learn, to speak freely about their grief, their hope, their truths. A resource center for the families of the missing. A sanctuary for those seeking resolution, even if the answers came years too late. Ellie would call it the Lantern House. She imagined it already wooden. Beams, tall windows, a trail behind the property leading into the forest, not as a place of fear, but of reflection. A way to honor what had been lost and what had been found. The groundbreaking ceremony took place in early autumn. The townsfolk came in quiet clusters, some holding candles, others just standing with folded hands and bowed heads. Sheriff Barnes was there too, standing at the edge of the crowd with his hat in his hands, eyes glinting in the morning sun. He had aged since the trial, lines deeper, shoulders more sloped, but there was peace in his face. Now, a burden lifted. Ellie took the microphone with hands that no longer trembled. She didn't speak for long, but her words reached deep. "We don't always get the endings we want," she said, voice steady, "but we do get the chance to shape what comes next. This house won't bring back those we've lost, but it will carry their names forward. And in doing so, I hope we build not just a place of remembrance, but a place of light." After the ceremony, people lingered, walking the land, touching the ribbons that marked the future walls, sharing stories. Some spoke of Laura and Daniel, recalling the way they danced, the joy in their eyes that night. Others spoke of their own loved ones, of mysteries still unresolved, of pain still raw. And in those conversations, something beautiful bloomed: connection. A reminder that grief, when shared, can become a bridge rather than a burden. That evening, Ellie returned alone. The sky was painted in bruised oranges and dusky pinks, the air thick with the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. She walked slowly through the clearing, imagining the rooms that would rise there, the voices that would fill them. At the center of the field, she knelt and placed a small wooden box into the soil. Inside was a copy of Laura and Daniel's wedding photo, the silver locket Ellie had found near the tree, and a handwritten note sealed in wax. She didn't need to read it aloud. It was meant for them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ellie sat back and looked up at the sky. The stars were beginning to prick through the dark like promises. She thought of the years she had spent searching, chasing shadows, begging the past to give her answers. And she thought of the unexpected grace of this new chapter, this chance to turn pain into purpose. Laura's legacy, Daniel's memory, they would not vanish. Not anymore. Their story had been unearthed, untangled, and now unburied. The truth was no longer hidden in the leaves or locked in a rusted trunk. It lived now in Ellie, in the town, in the foundation of what would rise from this once forgotten land. Somewhere, a barn owl called low and haunting in the distance. The trees rustled gently. Ellie rose to her feet, brushing the dirt from her jeans, her heart both heavy and whole. She would come back tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that still. There were things to build, people to help, stories to tell. The past had finally let her go, and she was ready not to forget, but to begin. Asterisk. And so, that's the story of Laura and Daniel, love that lit up a small town, a mystery that lingered like a shadow for years, and a truth that finally came to light through unwavering determination and love. Though they were taken too soon, their legacy will live on in the hearts of those who remember them and in the light of every story, like this one, that dares to seek the truth. Thank you, truly, for spending your time with me and listening to this story. Your presence means more than you know. If this story moved you, or made you think, or reminded you of something from your own life, I'd love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below to share your thoughts, your reflections, or even a story of your own. Every voice matters. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like. It really helps more people discover these stories. And if you'd like to hear more true, heartfelt stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification. Also, you never miss a new upload. Thank you again for being here. Until next time, take care of yourself and of each other.